Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on Ancient Roman History. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to talk about one of the greatest empires ever to walk the face of the earth. But it wasn't always that way. Rome actually starts quite small and develops way slower than the ancient Greeks. But at its peak, the Roman Empire is the only time in all of history, before or afterwards, that the entire Mediterranean is controlled by a single political power. So whether you want to make your horse a senator, or simply want to conquer the world, journey with me as we investigate ancient Roman history.
When compared to ancient Greece, and especially the empires of the ancient Near East, the Roman world gets a very late start. Rather than building palaces or pyramids or ziggurats during the Bronze Age, the second millennium BCE in Italy is essentially a collection of rather small settlements with rather small houses. The foundation of the city of Rome itself is traditionally dated to 753 BCE. Right around the same time Greece is coming out of the Dark Ages. And as the traditional story goes, it was founded by Romulus, descendant of the mighty Aeneas. But that's a story for a little bit later.
Now, interestingly here, archaeologists, they more or less concur. And so if you go up on top of the Palatine Hill, right, there's no superstructure for houses remaining, but there are these little post holes in the ground. And then there's also a little thin little trough where the wall used to have been. And when we date these things, they date back to the 8th century BCE, right around the same time of the mythical foundation date of Rome of 753. And they even have a little plaque that says, the hut of Romulus. So was it actually founded in 753? Well, we have no way of knowing. But it is very interesting that it's about that date where we get the first settlement on the Palatine Hill in Rome.
Later historians, writing more than 700 years after the traditional founding date of Rome, imagined this early period as a monarchy, consisting of 7 kings, starting with Romulus and ending with Tarquin the Proud, a king so terrible that Romans vowed never again to have another king in Rome. Now modern scholars have done the math, and it's essentially impossible for Rome to have only had 7 kings during this time, since each would have had to rule for about 40 years. But each of these 7 kings was symbolic, contributing some characteristic to the Roman people, or culture, or fabric of the Roman city.
So even though there weren't probably actually 7 kings in Rome, later Romans kind of looked at these supposed 7 kings as each contributing something kind of culturally or materially to the city of Rome. So Romulus kind of gives this ethos of a warrior, right? And Numa kind of gives this idea of piety and religion. Tarquin the Elder, he drains the forum, right? And allows there to be land cultivated between the hills. Servius Tullius, he builds the first wall around all the hills of Rome. And then Tarquin the Proud, well, he brings it all crashing down.
After the son of the last king tried to have his way with a senator's wife, the senators, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, rose up to drive the king out of Rome. It was then, in 509 BCE, that they established the Roman Republic, with the guiding principle that there should never be another king in Rome. 500 years later, Julius Caesar would be assassinated in an attempt to hold on to this ideology. Instead, the people of the Roman Republic would elect its representatives, and those representatives would then in turn be in charge of making laws. There would always be 2 consuls, the highest elected position, in order to balance power, and those consulships would only last for a single year in order to limit the power that could be held by a single person.
So when you think about it, modern American democracy is much more like kind of ancient Roman republicanism than it is the direct democracy of ancient Greece, right? We tend to elect representatives, those representatives go off to Congress, and they're the ones who tend to legislate, rather than all of us getting into a room to vote on every single little thing.
In the earliest days, Rome struggled with a major tension between the rich, known as the patricians because their ancestors could be traced all the way back to the founding of Rome, and the poor, known as the plebeians, who far outnumbered the rich in number but not in resources. Like all struggles for wealth and power, the people who had it wanted to keep it, and the people who lacked it wanted to obtain it as far as possible. In the early days of Rome, this struggle was known as the conflict of orders, and the plebeians would argue their case by seceding from battle, leaving the patricians to fight for themselves. Eventually, they won more political rights and a codified set of laws.
And as Rome grew, it started to take over all of Italy, and that occurred by the middle of the 3rd century BCE. And then Rome picks its first fight abroad against Carthage. And in a series of 3 wars known as the Punic Wars, Rome's able to defeat Carthage and transform itself from the dominant power in Italy to the dominant power across the entire Mediterranean.
But as Roman power expanded at an increasingly rapid rate, problems started to arise. Enemies were farther abroad, meaning that the 1-year rule for leaders was rather inconvenient. And those enemies were larger in scale, meaning that changes in leadership could have dire consequences. And people who fought in these wars often came back to farmland that had been lain barren and had to sell their land and move to the city to try to make a living. And during the 2nd century BCE, both wealth and power became stored in an increasingly smaller number of hands.
Now, the first people who realize they can rely on the poor and oppressed populations of Rome are the Gracchi brothers. And they realize that there's no constitutional need to take legislation to the Senate before it goes to the people for a vote. And so they take this land reform bill that's very beneficial to the kind of regular people of Rome, but not so beneficial to the senatorial aristocracy. They take that directly to the people. And it's a huge hit, except with the Senate. Both Gracchi brothers eventually die, one at the hands of the Senate, one committing suicide because he's about to be killed by the Senate. But they've unleashed a new way of power by cultivating the masses of the new metropolis.
During the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic dove deeper into conflict between leaders who courted the masses, the populares, and the leaders who courted the Senate, the optimates. The Roman generals Marius and Sulla epitomized these groups respectively. But while they live on opposite sides of the political divide, they were similar in that both craved ultimate power, and they weren't afraid of using their own armies to fight for that power. Rome was officially plunged into civil war, with some of the most powerful leaders since the time of the kings.
This, of course, culminates in Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar was the consul in Rome, the highest political elected position. And afterwards, he gets control of an army, and he gets control up in Gaul, right, the region we now call France. And after marching through Gaul and killing nearly 1 million people and enslaving 1 million more, he has this dilemma. He's got to get back to Rome to be reelected, but he can't take his army with him legally. And he knows that the Senate wants to lock him up. So he takes his army anyway, crosses the Rubicon River, and marches on the Senate in the city of Rome. The senators flee, and the first thing he does is he chases down the leaders of the Senate and defeats them. And eventually, when he makes his way back to Rome to rule, the remaining senators get together and say this guy is far too much like a king. And in 44 BCE, they assassinate Julius Caesar and say, "Sic semper tyrannis." Just like this, always, for tyrants.
Civil war didn't end with the death of Caesar. His successors, his adopted heir Octavian and his general Mark Antony, made quick work of the senatorial opposition. But as with so many in their position, neither Octavian nor Antony could bear to share power. Civil war continued until Octavian defeated Antony in 31 BCE, becoming sole ruler in Rome. And at a meeting in 27 BCE, the Senate decided it was better to have a single ruler than to be in perpetual civil war. They gave the victor the title of Augustus, who became Rome's first emperor.
Now, Augustus was a great guy to have as the first emperor. And first off, he just lives a really long time. He's in power for like 40 years. So that by the time he dies, most people don't even remember what the Republic used to be like. And second, he does a lot of active things to kind of cultivate this sense of peace. He treats the Senate and people with respect. They in turn treat him with respect. And he builds these kind of new buildings that also highlight the peace he's brought to Rome. Something like the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, or the temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, to avenge the death of his adoptive father.
But as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this takes almost no time at all to happen during the Roman Empire. Augustus' successors are all crazy. Tiberius is a pedophile, Caligula tries to make his horse a senator, Claudius just wants to be a historian, and Nero fiddles while Rome burns. But as it turns out, as long as they are just personally crazy and aren't using Roman armies to pick fights with other Romans, things work out pretty well. This period is known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, and it was generally a time of prosperity for those living within the Roman Empire.
So some of Rome's greatest monuments were built during the Pax Romana, right? The most famous, of course, is the Colosseum. But we also get the Imperial Fora and the Pantheon and Trajan's Column and the Stadium of Domitian and the Circus of Nero. Some of the things that you can still see in the fabric of Rome today all come from Rome's time at the peak of its empire.
But things fall apart, and in the 3rd century CE, Roman imperial power began to crumble. Trade networks broke down, invasions came from the outside, and emperors were being assassinated right and left. In fact, the average lifespan, once someone became an emperor, was only a couple of years, which really makes you wonder why anyone would want the job at all.
So, towards the end of the 3rd century BCE, the Emperor Diocletian comes up with a new plan. He's going to divide the empire into parts. And he's going to put 2 senior leaders in 2 of those parts, and then 2 junior leaders in other parts. And then the idea is after a set period of time, the senior leaders retire, the junior leaders take their place, and then you elect new junior leaders. So it's kind of a system of transmission of power. And Diocletian actually does retire, but he's the only one. It turns out after that, nobody wants to retire and give up their power, which leads to a whole new set of problems.
One of Diocletian's successors was a young man named Constantine, who was originally ruling from York, Roman Eboracum, in northern England. And soon he sets out for Rome to challenge his cousin for primary power in the Western Roman world. The night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, Constantine has a vision of the Chi Rho, the symbol of Christ in the sky, and hears the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign you will conquer. The next day he has his soldiers paint the symbol on their armor and on their shields, and he goes out to defeat his opponent. Soon he has consolidated sole power, and has become the first Christian leader in all of ancient Rome.
And this is usually what scholars call the transition to late antiquity, the kind of decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And the causes are certainly varied. Part of it is barbarian invasion, so they push from the east, they push westward, and eventually into Italy itself. Part of it is a breakdown in trade networks, in part caused by these barbarian invasions. We also get the kind of inflation of a bureaucracy to the point where it's unsustainable. And what this results in is the first sacking of Rome in 800 years, in 410 CE, by the Visigoths. Then 45 years later, it happens again, 455, by the Vandals. It's where we get our word vandalism. And then the final time in 476 CE by the Ostrogoths, when Odoacer the Ostrogoth takes over, ending the Roman Empire in the West for all of antiquity. So ancient Roman history is really interesting to study because it's the only time in history where the entirety of the Mediterranean is brought under a single political power. In addition, it's one of the few ancient cultures that takes its power and gives it to the people in the form of a republic. But in the end, the republic doesn't last. Conflict between aristocratic elites ends up bringing it to an end. But then when the empire is instituted, things turn out all right for a very long time. Just a few takeaway lessons you can learn from